Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming too on a rotten day. Could I just start by saying that half an hour is not long enough to talk about hedgehogs? I'm often introduced, in fact, as the man who studied hedgehogs for 50 years, which sounds really eccentric, but actually it was my job to teach students in the University of London, and that gave me the opportunity also to employ some of those students to help me study hedgehogs and answer some of the questions that people most frequently ask about them. And that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I wanted to do today, because we've only got half an hour, is to look at some of the issues which have become rather prominent. You must have noticed that hedgehogs have been all over the newspapers since well before Christmas. They've been discussed in Parliament. There's a petition, a big public petition going around at the moment, all sorts of things about hedgehogs. And so much of that is based upon the notion that hedgehogs are in serious decline, and we should be taking notice of that and doing something. And so it's very easy to read that kind of stuff, and we see so much of it now about wildlife in decline and much hand-wringing, and you wonder whether it's actually true or not. What's the basis for thinking that hedgehogs are in trouble? So I thought I'd spend some of the time today filling you in on a bit of the detail there, which actually underpins the statement that there is a problem with hedgehogs. And then I want to move on to looking at some of the things we might do about it. So, if you look at the books, the old books anyway, you'll find hedgehogs are normally described as common and widespread. And that's how we tend to think about hedgehogs, as being something that is fairly widespread in the country, as you see. And we're accustomed, or at least we were accustomed, to seeing their droppings on our lawns and dead ones on the roads and so on. So you get the idea that hedgehogs are not among our rare species. They're not sort of very rarely seen or only localized in their distribution. That is beginning to be an oversimplification, though. Because the poor old hedgehog has been around for 20 million years, but it's actually now facing up to all sorts of challenges from our modern life, if you like. And you can see from these pictures here, just highlighting some of the hazards that hedgehogs face. Getting tangled up in litter, getting run over on the road, getting mown by big mowing machines. Those big gang mowers there that mow the verges in the summertime, for example, are cutting back the grass for very good reasons, but we know now that that's exactly the kind of place where hedgehogs lie up during the day, during the summertime. And so they could be losing lots of hedgehogs like this, and we would never know because you don't find the bits. So we're conscious of hedgehogs that are killed on the road, but not those that are killed by mowing machines. And so I'll come back to some of those problems a bit later on. But one of the main problems I think that hedgehogs have faced in the last 100 years is the changing way that we use our countryside. And in particular, changing grazing farmland to arable farmland. It's said that at the time of the First World War, there were something like 7 million horses in this country. And horses need small fields with hedges and things, and they produce piles of dung which attract worms and insects that hedgehogs eat. Hedgehogs can forage in those fields, nest in the hedges. That kind of habitat is really quite good for hedgehogs. But if you sweep away grazing and hedgerows and replace it with what you see here, arable farming, you create a hedgehog desert because there's nowhere out on those fields where hedgehogs can nest during the day and particularly during the winter time. And the fields are sprayed with all sorts of chemicals whose whole purpose is to destroy the very things that hedgehogs need to feed on. And so if we start changing the countryside increasingly to arable farming, we're actually automatically causing problems for hedgehogs. But because we don't have dead ones lying around, you're not conscious of this as some kind of threat. But I'm sure that this is something which will have caused declines during the 20th century. But our worry is actually what's happening now in the last, say, decade or so, not necessarily what happened before that. And so we need to look at some of the problems that hedgehogs are facing right now. And I think one of the main issues is to do with habitat fragmentation in urban areas. And you can see from that picture there that lots of people have got gardens, and the gardens are themselves quite good habitat for hedgehogs, but they're all too small. Some of our radio tracking studies show that hedgehogs often use an area the size of an 18-hole golf course, and not many people have gardens that big. And so those gardens you see in the picture there are actually not big enough for hedgehogs to have a sustainable population. They're okay, though, those gardens, so long as they're linked up, so that collectively the gardens are quite good, good habitat, big enough area in suburban parts of our cities, but only if the gardens are linked up. And so long as people build new fencing, and they do, with new housing developments, or indeed replacing old fences, if you put up the wrong sort of fencing, you fragment this very good habitat into little patches that the hedgehogs can't reach, and the populations will be isolated and die out. So connectivity then across this kind of suburban habitat is vital, and again, I'll come back to that later on. If we don't have it, then that's one of the problems that hedgehogs face at the present time. So there you can see some of that sort of housing development at the bottom there, which we must have, and the government is committed to building loads more houses, and with it, thoughtlessly, come these wildlife-proof fences. Perhaps since we're actually in London, look, that top map there is actually a map I produced in the mid-1960s of London, and it's centred on St Paul's, a 20-mile radius on St Paul's, and those 1 kilometre squares filled in show the distribution of hedgehogs as it was in the 1960s. And I wouldn't mind betting that if we were to repeat that now, even with more intensive survey effort, you would find hedgehogs nowhere near as continuously abundant as that map implies. There's also a current problem with badgers, and this, of course, is very controversial. We know that badgers do predate hedgehogs, and one of the few things that can, badgers have got very long claws and very powerful forelimbs, so they can rip a hedgehog apart in a way that other mammals can't. But there's an equally difficult problem, and that is that badgers eat the same sort of food as hedgehogs. And so since a badger is quite big, each badger eats about the same as 5 hedgehogs, or 20 song thrushes, or 15 rooks or something. And you can't eat an earthworm twice. And so the more badgers that we have, the fewer there must be of something else. And the hedgehog is one of the losers on that. And some research that was done 30 years ago by Oxford University suggested that once you reach a certain threshold of badger density, then hedgehogs are under threat of extinction. It's simply from competition and perhaps predation as well. And so they've actually made a prediction about extinction, and that's a testable prediction which we're at the moment attempting to check what's happening. But even in the 1990s, that population density of badgers had been exceeded in several regions of this country, and so one would expect there to be a problem. And since then, badger numbers have increased probably by at least 10%, and maybe more. And so I love badgers. I mean, I'm not suggesting badgers bad news, but there is an inescapable problem that if you have more badgers, there'll be more pressure on the food supplies, and that will impact on hedgehogs and other things too, like song thrushes or rooks or whatever. So there is a sort of current problem then to do with badgers, and that gets mixed up with all the talk about badger culling, and so that's why it all becomes controversial and a bit political. So when we talk about hedgehogs then, and talk about decline, it's all very well for people to say, well, we haven't had hedgehogs in our garden for the last 10 years, and other people will say, no, that's a funny thing, haven't seen so many killed on the road this year. It's all kind of folklore, it's all anecdotal stuff, and you can't get officialdom or anybody else to take the issue seriously unless you can produce some sort of proof. And so what we've seen recently then is strongly directed arguments that hedgehogs are in decline. So where's the proof? And that's what I want to show you some of that now. What you see here is a graph of numbers of hedgehogs killed by gamekeepers. This is information from the Game Conservancy, and you can see there there's quite a long span of time, 1960 to 1990, 30 years, and the decline is more or less continued in a similar way. And you don't have to be a statistician to see that that's a downward trend, a pretty serious one, because the gamekeepers were killing only about half as many at the end of that period as they had been at the beginning. So there's some evidence, a graph that's going down. But of course, you could say that's because gamekeepers are getting lazy. It could be, they can't be bothered to kill hedgehogs anymore. Or it could be that there's some other factor involved in this. We don't know. Maybe there's fewer gamekeepers around, so that's why they're killing fewer hedgehogs. And so this kind of evidence points in a particular direction, but isn't conclusive. So what we need to do is to look for other evidence to see if it actually helps to support the trends that you see there. And one of the obvious things to do is to go and count the numbers of hedgehogs killed on the roads. And when I first suggested this on a radio programme, the BBC got a really long and bitter letter from some ecologist chap who said this was ridiculous and the BBC shouldn't be promoting fake science like this. Everyone knows, don't they, that the numbers of animals killed on the roads is simply a reflection of traffic density. More cars, more animals dead on the road. And so right from the start, this whole idea of counting hedgehogs was up against that criticism. On the other hand, we did keep seeing hedgehogs killed on the roads, and no one was bothering to count them. And so maybe we should actually start counting hedgehogs just to see what's happening. And so I set up a system where we had a structured counting system. People were asked to only count hedgehogs when they did journeys of more than 20 miles, not to count them in towns, not to count them on motorways where they don't get run over very often anyway, and not to do it in the rain or after dark. So, there was a structure to this survey, and each year there's volunteers sampled about 30,000 miles, and the results that we got, never mind all the small print, at the bottom there you can see surprising consistency. This is the number of hedgehogs killed per 100 miles driven. So that's an index then, numbers killed per 100 miles driven. And so that index then could be compared with later dates, later information. There's also an interesting thing there. The top three there, these are the regions, the index for 3 regions. You can see the top 3 are the same 3 in 4 consecutive years. And the bottom 3 are also the same bottom 3 in 4 consecutive years. In other words, we've got consistency here. So we're not counting random numbers. This isn't just all over the place. There is actually some sort of consistency which would give you some reason to think that perhaps there's something in this after all. And it's not a measure of traffic density, because when Mary and I went to New Zealand, we were counting hedgehogs there, and there were loads of them. And yet traffic density in New Zealand is laughable compared to here. I mean, hardly saw cars. I mean, and there were loads of hedgehogs dead on the roads. We also find in this country, as you just saw on the last slide, that you have a higher count. The number of hedgehogs killed per 100 miles driven is greater in the northeast of England than in the southeast of England. And anybody who drives around in the southeast of England knows very well that it's a pleasure to go to the northeast to get away from traffic. So there's further evidence then that this isn't about traffic density. And moreover, one of my colleagues, Paul Bright, has more recently validated the counting, if you like, by counting numbers of rabbits dead on the road and then comparing that with numbers of live rabbits seen beside the road. And the two are strongly correlated. So this is the evidence then that counting road kills is not about traffic density, and it is actually a way of monitoring hedgehog numbers. It doesn't tell you how many total have been killed, but it does give you an index that you can compare between regions and between years. And so this kind of survey of traffic road kills was repeated 10 years later by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. And you can see there Far larger sampling effort, more than 3 times as many miles covered in each year, and lots of journeys, lots of people, and 2.7 hedgehogs per 100 miles instead of 3.5. So that suggests that there's been something like a 25-30% decline in the numbers killed on the roads in 10 years. So that's the background to the claim that there's been substantial declines in the last decade or so. So we've had a 30% decline then overall, and that decline also continued in the 3 years that the People's Trust was running their Mammals on Road survey. So in other words, it wasn't just a sort of fluke of one year showing few hedgehogs. This was a continuing downward trend. Moreover, we've actually had other ways of looking at this, again indirectly. The People's Trust was having surveys of people like yourselves recording what they saw in their gardens. And you can see there a downward trend, which is, what's that one? The red line, I think that is. A downward trend of people recording hedgehogs seen in their garden consistently over quite a long time. At the same time, the British Trust for Ornithology had also been asking people to record what they saw in their gardens. And again, you see their data showing a trend. In other words, all of these different ways of looking at the issue are all pointing the same way, which is downwards. And it's not just a little bit downwards, it's a lot downwards. And so, again, helping to substantiate the claim that there's a problem for hedgehogs. So, I think that's pretty clear that hedgehogs are in decline. So what effect does it have on the total population size? And we don't know, because we don't know what the population size is. I mean, how would you set about finding out? And so we've seen some figures in the newspapers in recent times suggesting that there were 50 million hedgehogs in the 1950s, and there's now only 1.5 million. That's pretty serious decline. But actually, and I don't want to undermine the claim, but actually you shouldn't believe these figures, because the 50 million was, I think, published by Maurice Burton, whom some of you might remember, had a column in the Daily Telegraph a long time ago. And he actually personally told me that it was based on strolling around Kew Gardens one evening, and he thought around about 1 hedgehog per acre. And if you scale that up for the whole country, you get a population size of 50 million, okay? And so that's how scientific and solid that figure is. And it sounds much better if you read scientific papers that tell you it's 1.5 million, but actually the methodology is exactly the same. People have taken estimates for population density from some of my studies on golf courses, for example, or in the forest, in gardens, and averaged it out and multiplied it up for the country and said, well, we reckon it's about 1.5 million. But it could be like 50% wrong. And so we don't actually know what the total population is. It's virtually impossible to get a defendable figure, and so we can't say what the effect on the total population is, only that the numbers are going down very severely. So why are these declines occurring? Well, usual one, pesticides, yes. Pesticides will contaminate hedgehogs, but they're also, of course, designed to kill the things that hedgehogs need to eat. So there's a problem with pesticides. Road mortality, yes. I've published a figure that suggests about 15,000 are killed in a year. It's probably something like 4 or 5 times as many as that, because that is a rather simplistic figure. Habitat fragmentation, I mentioned earlier on, is a problem for them. Habitat changes to arable farming, I've talked about that. And there's a problem of badgers. So all of these things then are conspiring to make life difficult for hedgehogs. So what can we do about it? Let's get a bit more positive. First of all, people have got a soft spot for hedgehogs. They like them. We might discuss why, because they're smelly and got fleas and spiny and things. Why do people like hedgehogs? I don't know. But anyway, they do. And so people often find sick and injured hedgehogs and pick them up and take them to the RSPCA or an animal hospital or something. And most animals, if they're sick and injured, will bite you if you try and pick them up, but hedgehogs don't, and they don't run away either. And so the result of that is that more hedgehogs get taken into care than any other species of mammal. So these are now becoming quite a common feature of animal hospitals. And the good news is that we've done a series of studies to find out what happens to those sick and injured hedgehogs when they're released back into the wild later. And the good news is they manage extraordinarily well. Even baby hedgehogs reared in captivity who've never been out in the wild before, never seen a worm, never been outside a cage, never built a nest, all of them manage extraordinarily well. So if any of you have been involved in rescuing hedgehogs or looking after them and letting them go, rest assured it's a good thing. It is helping in a very small way to redress some of the losses that I've described. You can also help by putting out food for hedgehogs. And the traditional food for wildlife is bread and milk. Not a good thing for hedgehogs. The milk upsets their tummy and gives them diarrhea. They like it. They'll come in from a long way away to eat bread and milk, but it'd be better if you gave them something else, particularly meat-based dog foods. And again, if you're feeding your hedgehogs in a garden and want to talk about it, we can afterwards. But we've done some more studies about that and shown really it's on the whole a very positive thing to do. And it may be one of the reasons why hedgehogs are more common in suburban areas than in the countryside, because of the extra food that people put out for them. It's also important to remember that hedgehogs are one of our true hibernators. They spend 5 or 6 months of the year in hibernation, and for that they need to build a weatherproof nest. And there's no point in feeding hedgehogs in the garden and looking after them and all that in the summertime if you don't give thought to the other half of the year. It's half of the year, half of their life. They need a good winter nesting place. And the top picture on the right shows you an ideal nesting place for hedgehogs. There are a dozen or more hedgehogs nesting in those low brambles there when I studied nesting behaviour long ago. And so it would be really good if we made our gardens like that. I've actually found not a lot of support for that suggestion, particularly talking to garden clubs. But on the other hand, it does make the point. We have to think about the needs of hedgehogs in the winter. So if you can't actually have a sort of bramble-strewn garden, then yes, let's provide them with some sort of winter nest box. And the left-hand one is an example, and there's lots of others you've probably seen advertised. And they cost sort of 30 or 40 quid each. I mean, if you want, fine, get one. But it's not necessary. You can make a cheap substitute, as you can see on the right there, with just a bit of wood against the wall or a fence underneath the garden shed. There are all sorts of ways in which you can help the hedgehog spend the winter. So all you need to do is think hedgehog and remember that they need somewhere to spend the winter. If you want to buy a nest box, fine. It can't do any harm, and I do know that hedgehogs will use them, which is good, but you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. But we do need to remember that there's an issue over winter, and we can and should try and do something to help hedgehogs over winter. Then there's this problem of fences I mentioned at the beginning, this habitat fragmentation. You see the top left picture there is garden fencing that comes right down to the ground, and that stops anything moving from one garden to another. Not just hedgehogs, but frogs and toads. They can't get to the garden ponds, because the fences are in the way. And so it's possible to remove the gravel board, the thing at the base, from one section of the hedge and replace it, as you see top right, by some large big grid wire panels, which will allow smaller things to come through underneath the fence, but keep out larger things. But we've been suggesting that people make a hole in the fence about the size of a CD, like this. And that's big enough for hedgehogs, frogs, toads, newts, and so on, to move between gardens and use the habitat widely. But people say, well, we don't want a hole in the fence because we don't want next door's dogs coming through. Well, okay, fine. You don't want the cats. Well, the cats can go over the fence if they want. But dogs and cats can get through a cat flap this kind of size. What they can't do is get through a tunnel that size. And so you just simply cut the hole in the fence and put one of those concrete blocks up against it. And They don't cost very much, about £3, and you've then turned a hole into a small tunnel. And the animals with longer legs can't easily get through there. And so you're making a wildlife passageway, which is a filter, if you like, letting through the things you want and keeping out the things, some of the things anyway, you don't want. But we do need to actually assure some form of permeability in our garden habitats. Otherwise, we break the place up into small units, which will not be large enough to support hedgehogs, or indeed much else. So that's one of the things you can do. So think hedgehog. Think about litter. There's a hedgehog who's got his head stuck in a polystyrene cup, trying to lick out the goodies at the bottom. It tries to back out, the spines get jammed into the polystyrene, and the thing will die. You can see a hedgehog there tangled up in garden netting. If you've got garden netting, don't leave it lying around, because the hedgehogs will burrow underneath, get their spines and feet tangled up in it. If you've got a garden pond, put a little escape ramp in. That's a National Trust one, so it's nice, neat and tidy. But you could just have a few bricks in the corner of the pond, or a piece of chicken wire, anything to help the hedgehog climb out if it falls in. Hedgehogs can swim. What they can't do is climb out of garden ponds that are made of plastic with smooth sides. And so, we can help hedgehogs avoid that unnecessary hazard. And take care when using strimming machines. They chop hedgehogs up very regularly and are responsible probably for most of the injuries you see in animal hospitals. So if you're going to use a strimmer, cut the vegetation down first, but fairly high. Check it out for nests of hedgehogs, and then trim the rest of it if you must. Don't just trim it right down to ground level to start with, otherwise you're going to be chopping up any hedgehogs that are there. And the same with garden bonfires. Just turn the stuff over before you set light to it, and there may well be all sorts of things living under there, quite apart from hedgehogs. And so remember, lots of these things that we might do to help the hedgehog are actually good for other things as well, and help to maintain biodiversity in our garden habitats. And just recently, an MP has started a campaign to change the law. Let's change the law, get some better protection for the hedgehog. If you've seen that campaign, I think they've got about 20,000 signatures online at the moment. If it gets to be 100,000, then Parliament has to discuss the matter. But the way you change the law is to modify the schedules of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And that isn't going to be terribly helpful. It protects the hedgehog from all sorts of things which are actually not a serious worry. You can't have laws that actually protect hedgehogs from increasing arable farming. You can't have laws that say you mustn't have fences around your gardens. I mean, the things that really threaten hedgehogs are not actually covered by changes in the law. But by all means, change it, because it draws attention to the need to look after hedgehogs. But we need other actions rather than simply changing the wording of the law. So what we have got is the campaign called Hedgehog Street, which is a partnership between the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, whose tie I'm wearing at the moment, and the People's Trust for Endangered Species. And they're currently organising all sorts of practical things to do with hedgehogs, but also providing lots of suggestions for people with access to the internet. So if you go to that website there, Hedgehog Street, just put that into Google, there's loads of different suggestions of things that can be done to help hedgehogs practically in gardens and around the countryside. There's something like, I think it's about 40,000 people now have signed up to Hedgehog Street, and about half of them have already done something by way of making their garden more suitable for hedgehogs. So this is actually reaching out and really doing something good to help the hedgehogs. So join in, why not? And if you need some more information, this book I mentioned earlier on has got everything else in it that I'm not talking about now. The general biology of hedgehogs and their natural history, all sorts of the things, the questions that people used to keep asking me about, how long they live and all that sort of thing. It's all in the book, it's done well, and the new edition here costs £15 in the shops. I get them cheaply and sell them for 10, and these are my last 3 copies if anybody wants them. If we run out now, I can get some more from the publishers. But anyway, if you need some more information, that's the best place. And the other thing you can do is have a look at some of these other websites here, The top one is the Hedgehog Preservation Society. The next one's the People's Trust for Endangered Species. But the best single entree to all of this is the website for Hedgehog Street. Okay, so that's the hedgehog's background then to all the fuss and palaver we've seen in the newspapers lately. And the good news is we're actually trying to do something big to help. And if any of you contributed to the Times charity appeal over Christmas, the hedgehog was one of the themes that you could donate towards. Times raised £52,000 that way. And so we're using that money this year to employ 2 hedgehog officers whose job it is to actually get out there on the ground, knocking on doors and telling people to fix their fence and try and organise whole areas of cities and suburban areas to have the gardens linked up properly to achieve permeability for hedgehogs and all sorts of other things. And so, again, if you contributed to that, that's where some of your money's going. Okay, so that's the basis then for the current claims about hedgehogs being in decline and what we're doing about it. If you want to ask questions, then here's your opportunity, or you can read the book.